בוקר טוב, אני מבקש מכולם לשבת. Thank you. Mr. Yo-Yo Ma, recipient of the Dan David Prize, past category, and members of the Silk Road Ensemble, honored guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Department of History, which I am chairman, let me welcome you to our morning symposium, The Silk Road Then and Now. I'm not going to talk very much at all because we have a very full and interesting program today. I just want to thank my fellow members of the organizing committee, Professor Amy Singer, the professor of Ottoman history in the Department of Middle Eastern and African history, and Professor Aaron Shai, the professor of Chinese history in our own Department of History. I'd like also to thank Smadar Fisher and Malka Ben Chaim from the Dan David Prize who helped make this morning possible. Let me then introduce the first chairman, Professor Erad Malkin, who is professor of ancient history and the head of the Mediterranean Civilizations Project in the Department of History. Professor Malkin.
Thank you, David. The Silk Road. The Silk Road is a road. The Silk Road is a system of interconnected roads with varying points, with land routes and sea routes. The Silk Road, in and of itself, symbolizes connectivity, symbolizes the ebb and flow of ideas and goods, symbolizes exchange. In the current mindset of historical thinking, which argues sometimes against the notions of centers and peripheries, what is really important, what is less important, and instead emphasizes connectivity, emphasizes precisely the multifarious and varied types of connections among human societies. The Silk Road is a beautiful emblem and symbol of the Silk Road project headed and initiated by Mr. Yo-Yo Ma, the recipient of the Dan David Prize. I'm particularly excited to be here today, having been the director of the Dan David Prize for a year. I know exactly what goes on into the meticulous and hard selection of categories and candidates. And we're very proud and happy to have Mr. Yo-Yo Ma here today and to chair this morning session on the Silk Road. Let me quote to you in English. I'll translate. There's one book in Hebrew by a travel writer called Tzur Sheizaf, who's wondering in his book on the Silk Road, Derech HaMeshi, whether it is the road that makes the people, or is it vice versa? Perhaps it is the people who make the road. What influences what? And I think this morning we have a long and rich program, and I would like to mention our first speaker of this morning, Professor Aaron Shai, who will talk about China and the Silk Road. Professor Shai holds the Eisenberg Chair for Asian Studies at our university. He's the founder of the Asian Studies Department at Tel Aviv University. He's the former chair of the History Department, and he's published numerous books and 2 wonderful novels as well. So, Aaron Shai, China and the Silk Road. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. The region that separates China from Europe and Western Asia has caught the imagination of researchers throughout the ages. Many scholars have believed that this area holds the lost key to understanding the 2 clusters of cultures, the Chinese on the one hand and the European Western Asian culture on the other, and that it could help us gain insights into the problematic and unclear contact between them. Indeed, it seems at times that the more inhospitable this region, which is known in part as the Silk Road, seemed, the more challenging and attractive it became to both researchers and explorers. This is indeed an inhospitable region which few roads cross, and in the past, caravans usually skirted its edges, with travelers hopping from one isolated oasis to another. If we examine the western section of the Chinese Silk Road, say from today's border with Russia, west of Kashgar, we see that the dry ecoregion known as the Tarim or the Taklamakan Desert consists of the world's largest shifting sand desert. 85% of this ecoregion is made of sand dunes that support scarce or no vegetation at all. There is little biodiversity in this harsh environment, yet such mammals as the wild Bactrian camel and the Asian wild ass still make it their home. Unusable as a farmland for humans, the Taklamakan Desert remains very much intact, although nowadays nuclear testing in Lop Nor represents a considerable threat to its unspoiled wilderness conditions. As we all know, in different eras, the Silk Road allowed erratic, unreliable, and inconsistent contact between East and West. Opened somewhere around 200 BC, its golden age was not until about 600 AD during the Tang dynasty, that is to say between 1618 and 907 in China. Under the Song and the Yuan dynasties, 960 to 1271, Silk Road trade saw a resurgence after a period of almost disuse lasting a few decades. However, this was short-lived because of the ravages of Genghis Khan and Timur the Great, the development of maritime trade routes, and the increasing desertification of Eastern Central Asia, which made travel by caravan more and more perilous. The establishment of the Ming dynasty in China in 1368 marked the end of the silk trade along the Silk Road. The maritime Silk Road, often neglected by us, by researchers in our discourse, became much friendlier and was quite instrumental in introducing Muslim culture and trade to the Chinese. So in fact, we have to remember that while we talk about the Silk Road, and this is our main theme today, there was and still is what people call sometimes the maritime Silk Road. The Hui people, who now dwell in southern China, say in Fujian province, are the descendant of that contact. In general, the Asian powers had almost no record of maritime achievement, and historically speaking, it can be argued that they yielded command to the sea to the Europeans. Even when they developed seagoing commerce of great magnitude in Indian and Pacific waters, they could not contend and compete with the Western newcomers for sea power. The reason for this was simply that behind their enterprise lay no driving force and no political commercial motivation which could result in building an impressive naval power. Today's equivalent of part of the Silk Road is the Karakoram Highway built by China and Pakistan, which runs from Islamabad to Kashgar. The main difference, however, is that today, along this route, instead of camels carrying bales of silk, the traffic consists of trucks carrying oil. Geoffrey F. Hudson, a fellow of All Souls College in Oxford in the late 1920s and 30s, who also happened to be my thesis supervisor, published his most important book in 1931. It was entitled Europe and China, a survey of the relations from the earliest times to 1800. In his pioneering study, he notes that Andrew Corsalis, a 16th century scholar of China, wrote to Duke Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, in 1515, and he described the Chinese as di nostra qualità, which can be freely translated as being on par with ourselves, or in today's language, it would simply mean that they were almost all normal human beings, flesh and blood, and not extraterrestrial creatures or monsters. The Chinese repaid that compliment by a still current proverb that they, the Chinese themselves, and they alone, possess two eyes, that the Franks, that is the Europeans, have one eye, and that other inhabitants of the world are blind. Indeed, the basic Chinese concept that China was the Middle Kingdom and that its people, the Han, maintained the only true way, Tao, persisted despite, or one perhaps can argue because, of their encounter with the foreign devils. The two civilizations, the Chinese on the one hand and the Europeans on the other, have grown up culturally and come of age in geographical isolation from one another. Dwelling at opposite ends of the old world, although initially neither knew of the other's existence, mutual knowledge later seeped through, carried by rumors, the passage of commodities, and later on by more direct communication and travel. We must remember that civilized Europe was one under the Roman Empire, while China was, during most of that era, divided between separate states. Later, during the early modern and modern periods, the division changed, and China became whole on the whole, and united under the various dynasties, the Yuan, the Ming, and the Qing, and Europe became a mosaic of different nation groups, each with its own government. Today, Europe is almost united, or at least moving up towards such a political structure, and it remains to be seen whether China will indeed remain unified in view of the widening economic gaps between her respective provinces, or whether it will break up into an economic warlord-like system. Earlier, I mentioned the Chinese portion of the Silk Road. That is the western Chinese section of the road, which stretches from today's border with Russia, west of Kashgar, to the Tarim or Takla-Makan Desert. It seems appropriate now to say a few words about the eastern section of the Chinese Silk Road, that is to say, the area around Xi'an, the old capital of China. In the 2nd century BC, when the Silk Road first began being used as a trade route, the Chinese considered the city of Xi'an the center of the Chinese world, and it was from there, so they at least believed, that the Silk Road actually began. Merchants, pilgrims, bandits, and soldiers all set out on their long journey westwards from that point. The Han Empire of the 2nd century BC rivaled that of the Roman Empire, which existed at the same time as mentioned. The two empires knew nothing of one another, being separated by mountains, tracts, and vast wastelands. From the information we have, it seems that a turning point occurred when the emperor dispatched a special envoy to recruit new allies to protect the empire against the surrounding hostile tribes. That envoy, whose name was Zhang Tian, rode off from Xi'an only to return 13 years later, not with people to help him fight, but with people who wanted to trade, and thus the Silk Road was born. Till today, many still regard Zhang Tian as the father of the Silk Road. From that juncture, Xi'an became the focal point for the East and West encounter. Ores, gold, ivory, precious stones, and glass would travel the Silk Road from Europe, Persia, and Arabia, while for their part the Chinese traded in iron, bronze, jade, ceramics, and most exotic of all, silk. The Chinese had discovered how to make silk almost 2,000 years earlier, and later inventions followed, such as paper, books, gunpowder, cast iron, and even the wheelbarrow. By the 8th century, Xi'an was the largest in the world, and China was an attraction for travelers who brought ideas, philosophies, and faiths, such as Buddhism and Eastern religions, into China from the outside world. And this was during, of course, mainly from the Arab countries. The influence of this cultural exchange is still evident in the city of Xi'an. We talk about Xi'an today, and we mention it apropos the terracotta soldiers, but in fact we have to remember that the history is much more extended and longer. The Great Mosque in Xi'an appears more Chinese than Arabic, but in the late 8th century it was the religious center for Arab merchants in China. Today, the city has an entire Muslim quarter where around 75,000 Hui people live after their ancestors arrived on the Silk Road trading goods. I shall not dwell on the long centuries between the 8th century and the present, or the fluctuations characterizing the history of the Silk Road and the foreign influence that it experienced. However, I would like to mention that Marco Polo's accounts of his travels, if indeed he went to China, and we know of Francis Wood's recent thesis argues that he did not. He describes journeying along what we term the Silk Road. In the 13th and 14th century, one can talk about the rise and expansion of the Mongol Empire, in fact, Pax Mongolica, over much of the traditional Silk Road, or as it has become or should be known, Silk Roads in the plural. We, of course, shall hear about it from our friend and colleague, Professor Reuven Amitai. But let me mention that under the Mongols, trade and travel were facilitated along many of these routes. The disintegration of the Mongol Khanate together with the discovery of the sea routes, which I mentioned earlier, from Europe to Asia, in the late 15th century, disrupted the Silk Road's trade and led to a decline in trade in parts of Central Asia. Ocean faring commerce superseded overland trade on the Silk Roads. Characteristically, perhaps, Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit priest, set out from Italy in 1577 to bring Christian faith and Western thought to Ming Dynasty China, but he took the maritime route. As for the modern period, in terms of the effect of foreign control and influence by Russians, Japanese, later the Soviets or the Chinese communists, we see some local reaction and consequently the emergence, to the extent that it was at all possible, of indigenous ethnic and religious nationalities, not to mention the establishment of independent countries in some of the regions mentioned. As some have suggested, we should now perhaps refer to the trade routes as the oil and gas roads, as Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and perhaps Mongolia dispatched the new gold of petroleum, a resource with the power to offer the region greater significance and prosperity in the modern world. The construction of roads around the edges of the Taklamakan Desert has eased access to this desert region, and the discovery of large oil reserve under its sand has encouraged this development. The area is now undergoing rapid industrialization, and Urumqi, the present capital of Xinjiang province, has developed into a particularly unprepossessing high Chinese industrial city. The railway connecting Langzhou in Gansu province to Urumqi has been extended to the border with Kazakhstan, where in 1990 it finally joined the former Soviet railway system, providing an important route to the new republics and beyond. The Euro-Asian continent bridge, built to rival Trans-Siberian railways, stretches all the distance from Linyungan city in Jiangsu province on the eastern part of China to the Dutch port of Rotterdam. The first phase of this development has already been completed. It will be at least 20% cheaper than the route by sea, and at over 10,000 kilometers long, it will be significantly shorter. From China, the route passes through Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, and Poland before reaching Germany and the Netherlands. Double tracking the railway from Langzhou to the border of the former Soviet Union is now a top priority in Chinese development. By way of conclusion, let me mention that from its earliest days before Christ, the Silk Road made its mark on the civilizations on both sides of the Asian continent. In modern times, with the latest developments and changes in political and economic systems, the edges of the Taklamakan Desert may see international trade once more. This time, however, the scale promises to be far greater than in the days of the old route, with the iron horse replacing the camels and horses that made their way across in the past. On the whole, the Silk Road is much more than a route, a line of communication. It is a concept, and I think this was emphasized also last night by Mr. Yo-Yo Ma and others, and denotes cultural connection, but most significantly, it denotes hope for the cities, people, and nations whose life it touches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shai. It's a great privilege to have with us a guest from the other place in Israel, that is the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Professor Reuven Amitai, who is the Eliyahu Eilat Professor for the History of the Muslim Peoples at the Hebrew University. He's also the director of the Nehemiah Lev Zion Center for Islamic Studies. Professor Amitai has published numerous articles edited two major books on the subject, and he's the author of Mongols and Mamelukes, the Mameluk Iqahamid War, sorry if I mispronounce it, published by Cambridge at University Press in 1995. Today, Professor Amitai will talk to us for the next 20 minutes on the Silk Road, from the Silk Road to a superhighway, Eurasia under the Mongols. Professor Amitai, please.
Good morning. I would like to thank first the organizers for inviting me to this prestigious and impressive gathering here at Tel Aviv University, held as part of the events surrounding the awarding of the Dan David Prizes. May I add my own small voice to the congratulations bestowed upon Mr. Yo-Yo Ma, who is the 2006 Dan David Prize Laureate for the Pastime Dimensions, for his work to preserve the cultural heritage of Asia in general and Central Asia in particular. For some time, scholars have recognized the important role played by Central or Inner Asia and its peoples in the history of Asia and beyond. It appears to me that this recognition has gained in strength in the past generation or so. Certainly, this is the case in Israel. The history, culture, and politics of the ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary Central Asia are now taught and studied at 3 universities in our country, all of which have representatives here today. This growth is tied to several factors: the development of Asian studies here in Israel, the increasing understanding of the Central Asian element in Islamic culture and history, the coming to Israel of eminent scholars of Central Asia from the former Soviet Union, the opening up of this area to travelers and scholars, and perhaps the widening horizons of a new generation of Israeli scholars and historians. In any event, Central Asia is now firmly on the scholarly map in Israel. Events like today's will certainly serve to reinforce the importance of the region in the consciousness of people in academic and popular circles. By Central Asia, by the way, I am referring to the wide region stretching from the north of the Black Sea to the north of China, including a wide swath of the last mentioned country. This area is sometimes referred to as Inner Asia and includes the vast Eurasian steppe. One could argue with these definitions, but they will do for now. The exact borders, be they geographical, cultural, and even political at times, of Central Asia are unclear and possibly can never be delineated. Perhaps this confusion reflects the cultural and political interaction of Central Asia with the sedentary world that borders it on the south and west. Certainly, most of Central Asia was never cut off from the countries of sedentary civilization, and in some ways was dependent upon them. At the same time, one could argue that we could hardly understand the history of China, India, Iran, Anatolia, Eastern Europe, and beyond without taking into account the role played by Central Asia and its peoples. How did Central Asia play such an important part in the history of Asia and Europe? We might begin with the great role played by the nomadic peoples who came out of Central Asia or threatened to do so, and so influenced their neighboring sedentary countries. We could mention, and this list is only a partial one, the Scythians, the Huns, the medieval Turks, the Magyars, and the Mongols. Based on disciplined masses of light cavalry, who mostly employed the small but powerful composite bow on horseback, the nomads of the Eurasian steppe were virtually unbeatable, or at least many people thought so at the time. In many, perhaps most cases, the combination of mobility and firepower, and I use the word firepower in a metaphorical sense, created a threat that was sufficient to wrest all kinds of concessions from sedentary neighbors, most frequently tribute, which is a polite term for protection payments. Sometimes, however, Central Asian nomads launched raids to achieve booty and to intimidate. That is, to make sure that tribute would flow in. On occasion, raids were turned into campaigns of conquest. The most famous and significant of these campaigns of conquest were, of course, those launched by the Mongols in the early and mid-13th century. More about them later. I will note that the deadly reputation of the nomads of Central Asia has been well established for thousands of years. From the Gog and Magog of the Bible to the novel The Tartar Steppe by Dino Buzzati and the portrayal of the Huns in the Walt Disney movie Mulan here just a few years ago, the Eurasian nomads are portrayed as the wild barbarian scourge of culture and mankind. Yet, with all due respect to the military aspects and the resulting destruction of the peoples of the Eurasian steppe. And there is no doubt that at times this could lead to destruction and massacres, be it in Central Asia, in the frontier areas, or even deep within the sedentary world. There is another side to the nomadic culture of the Eurasian steppe. Since the advent of full-blown pastoral nomadism in Central Asia around 1000 BCE, nomadic peoples and states have often been great patrons of material and at times intellectual culture. One can look at some of the finds from the Scythian tombs from southern Russia and the southern Ukraine from around the 5th century BCE for clear proof of this. But the nomads were more than just patrons and consumers of high culture, much, maybe most of which came from sedentary areas. They also facilitated the transfer of cultural objects through Central Asia, much of this steppe land, from one end of Asia to the other. These so-called cultural objects could be physical commodities for elite and even mass consumption, artistic objects, actual artists and artisans, other human conveyors of cultural, intellectual, and religious ideas, scientific and intellectual concepts, and religious beliefs. These cultural objects, be they physical or abstract, were passed on only with the connivance, encouragement, or at least a tacit agreement of the nomads for centuries, sometimes more and sometimes less, depending on both conditions in Central Asia as well as at either side of Asia or beyond. This system of transportation of physical and cultural commodities and ideas is often referred to as the Silk Road or Silk Roads, a term evidently coined by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. Whether silk was ever the main commodity transported over this route is an open question, although the means for producing it may well have at some point traveled from east to west in this way. In any event, we should be aware that at no point are we dealing with a real road, one real road. On the other hand, over time, certain routes became well established, and modern scholars have devoted not insignificant energies to trying to map these out. This is certainly a worthy pursuit, but in the framework of the present lecture, I think we can look at the Silk Road, or the Silk Roads, as a kind of metaphor, referring to a large steppe of territory over which ideas and commodities traveled back and forth from East and West Asia. And please note, from the beginning this was far from a one-way route. After this somewhat lengthy introduction, I may now look at the Mongols, who certainly represent the culmination of many of the tendencies embodied by the Eurasian steppe societies, and their interaction with sedentary countries and civilizations. As is well known, the Mongol Empire emerged in the steppe north of China in the early 13th century after Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes and some of their Turkish neighbors. By 1210, the Mongols had invaded China in earnest, while they had commenced their expansion westward across the steppe. This led to the first invasions of the Islamic world in 1219, the conquest of Russia by the late 1230s, and the campaigns into Hungary and Poland in 1241. By 1260, Mongol rulers controlled most of China, all of the Middle East up to the Euphrates, the entire Eurasian steppe, and all of what today constitutes European Russia and the Ukraine. Contemporary observers would not have been faulted for thinking that the Mongols would continue their project of world conquest. In fact, except for China, Mongol expansion had pretty much run out of steam. Yet Mongol rule was to continue for many generations in the areas just mentioned, leaving a deep impact on the societies that they ruled. The Mongols created perhaps the greatest land empire in human history, and certainly the largest one founded by nomads, Eurasian or otherwise. As has been just seen, it was not just a flash-in-the-pan phenomenon, unlike many nomadic states before and after. Unlike most of their Eurasian nomadic predecessors, they were not content to remain in the steppe region, enjoying revenues derived from trade, payments from neighboring sedentary countries, and some small-scale conquest. The Mongols, first led and inspired by Genghis Khan, had set their sights on bigger things. The destructiveness of the Mongol campaigns is well documented. Many millions found their death, and countless cities were attacked, sacked, and often destroyed throughout Asia and Eastern Europe. The Mongols were equal opportunity annihilators, and it does not appear that the inhabitants of one country got off lighter than another. The Mongols could also rule with a heavy hand, and there is no doubt that their rule could be onerous with negative results. Here, however, the record is more varied. Some areas seem to have suffered more than others from their rule, why certain regions appeared to have enjoyed a rather benign form of Mongol control. Finally, there were those territories which actually prospered under Mongol rule, enjoying economic and demographic growth and serving as centers of cultural life. While it may not have given much solace to the many victims of Mongol expansion, it is also clear that the Mongol period was one of cultural effervescence throughout most of their empire, or much of their empire. There are several reasons to explain this intellectual and artistic flowering. First, the Mongol rulers themselves enjoyed huge wealth and also enjoyed the role of cultural patrons. Secondly, the Mongols instituted a regime of relative religious and intellectual freedom. The Mongol rulers, on the whole, did not try to impose any religion on their subjects, and thus peoples of all faith were welcome to participate in the intellectual and cultural discourse of the empire. The Mongols then created a truly multicultural environment throughout the vast territories that they ruled, which created a firm basis for cultural and intellectual development. Thirdly, and most relevant to our topic today, Asia was open from one end to another. People, be they government messengers, traders, scholars, or missionaries, could move from Iran to China and back via Central Asia with relative ease. Now, relative ease is perhaps too strong a word and understates the great difficulty that faced a traveler at Inner Asia at this time. Perhaps I should phrase it differently. Under the Mongols, travelers passed through Central Asia, or to give it another name, the Silk Route, with significantly less hindrance than before. This led to a growth in the number of travelers with their commercial, cultural, and intellectual baggage, in turn contributing to greater artistic and scholarly exchange between the two sides of Asia. We can note that even in times of discord and war between different Mongol rulers, which was often the norm after the breakup of the United Mongol Empire around 1260 CE, on the whole, travelers could pass via Central Asia between the Golden Horde, located in European Russia of today, and Iran on one hand, and Mongolia and China on the other hand, with relative impunity. Perhaps the most famous of these travelers, and we've already heard about him, at least in the popular consciousness in the West, is the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who arrived in China by way of Central Asia in the early 1270s, and returned home at the end of the 13th century, although via India and via the sea. Polo's books of his experiences and observations, dictated while he was cooling his heels in a Genoese prison some years later, had a great influence on Europe, not the least since it brought an accurate and accessible portrait of China to Europe for the first time, and I, for one, at least think that Marco Polo did make it to China. I think that it is important to note that the growth of travel and the increasing transference of cultural goods, be they physical or otherwise, of various forms on the Silk Route and of Central Asia under the Mongols, was not only a function of political unification and greater security, although these were certainly important factors. As the eminent American Mongolist Thomas Ellison has pointed out, one should also take into account the great role of the Mongol rulers and elite in promoting the movement of artistic and intellectual items, both as consumers of these things and as patrons for the greater good as they understood it. Thus, Mongol taste and policy shaped the nature of the traffic on the Silk Route in the 13th and 14th centuries. They were not just passive recipients of these goodies, but molders of cultural policy on various levels. In what areas can we speak of discernible influence and transference of ideas, technology, artistic motifs, and other cultural items? We can note such areas as geography, cartography, agriculture, food, medicine, astronomy, printing, historiography, religion, painting, ceramics, and textiles. As you can discern, these range among a wide spectrum of topics, and some received more of a push from the Mongol rulers than others. These matters also varied in their impact. Some were limited to the elite, others were adopted by at least part of the subject populations. Many had a lasting impact, while some may have been of short duration. In any event, invariably all these goods and ideas were transferred between East and West, sometimes concurrently in both directions, via the Silk Route of Central Asia. One interesting area of interaction between East and West Asia was the area of textiles. The Mongol elite, soon after the establishment of their state and commencement of the conquest in both China and the Muslim world, developed a strong proclivity for fancy textiles and clothes, not the least silk brocade, meaning silk embroidered with gold thread. They were particularly enamored with the cloth and other textiles produced in the Muslim countries. It appears that these textiles, which were somewhat bulky, were difficult and expensive to be transported in the desired quantities from the Middle East via Central Asia to Mongolia and North China, the centers of the United Mongol Empire. An interesting and effective solution was hit upon. Literally thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of Muslim weavers and other craftsmen were forcibly moved with their families from one side of Asia to another, and factories were established in Mongolia and China for the manufacture of the desired cloth. This was distributed to the Mongol elite and common tribesmen alike, welding them to the royal family. Another area of exchange via the Silk Route is the study and practice of medicine. Under the Mongols, Muslim and Christian physicians from the Middle East went to the East, and their Chinese equivalents came to the Islamic world. But the mutual transfer of medical and pharmacological knowledge was not only a result of the physical presence of these specialists, but also the apparent export of medical works and oral transmission of folk medicine. One example of a West Asian medical practitioner working in China was the Nestorian Christian from Samarkand, Mar Sargis, who was responsible for the manufacture of medical ices, known by the Arabic Persian word sharbat, and thus he was referred to as a sherbatchi, a title which the Turkologists in the audience can appreciate. Marco Polo himself met Mar Sargis, then the Mongol governor in the lower Yangtze region. For me personally, an area of particular interest that shows the intellectual give and take between East and West under the Mongols is historiography. I would like to touch briefly on the great historical work by the Persian bureaucrat, physician, and scholar Rashid ad-Din Hamdani, a Jewish convert to Islam who served as wazir to the Mongol Khans of Iran for about 20 years until his execution in 1318. His work, originally written in Persian but having the Arabic title of Jami' al-Tawarikh, or Assembly of Histories, is really, at least to my mind, the first attempt to write a truly universal history of humankind as then known. In the center of this work, as to be expected, is the history of the Mongols. But we have extensive sections on the kings of China and other rulers in East Asia, as well as the treatment of Indian history. At the same time, the Jews are given their due, as are, of course, the Muslims and the precursors of the caliphs in the region, plus the rulers of the Franks and elsewhere in the West. We know of some of Rashid ad-Din's informants from China and India, as well as his sources for Mongolian history. Besides his own genius and wide intellectual horizons, how do we explain his scholarly tour de force? I would suggest that it was the Mongol Empire, with its cosmopolitan ambiance on one hand and its vast geographical expanse on the other, that provided the intellectual and actual infrastructure for Rashid ad-Din's great historical project. People and ideas, along with the knowledge about faraway places and their history, passed along the Silk Route from one side of Asia to another. It was truly under the Mongols that the Silk Route, which has experienced, as we heard just before, its ups and downs in previous centuries, became a silk superhighway. More people, more commodities, and more ideas traveled to and fro, uniting in some ways Asia more than it would be until perhaps our own times, and we also heard about that. The effects were felt beyond the main centers of civilization in Western and Eastern Asia. As said before, perhaps the most famous traveler on the Silk Route was Marco Polo. His book, which records his experiences and observations, probably did more than anything else to bring China, India, and their neighbors into European consciousness, thus fueling and perhaps inspiring European desires to find alternative routes to the East. Ironically, it was a merchant with a keen eye passing along the Silk Route at its height, who contributed indirectly to creating the conditions which were to make the Silk Route increasingly less relevant to international commercial intercourse and intercultural exchange. We are grateful, however, for those who work today to keep alive the memory of the Silk Route and to preserve its heritage for all humankind. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amitai, for this truly illuminating perspective on the Silk Route. And I would like to call upon Ms. Wu Man to give us a solo rendition on a Chinese lute, the virtuoso pipa. Ms. Wu Man, please.
Sorry. before Wuman plays, I'd just like to give a couple words of introduction. First of all, thank you, Professor Shai and Professor Amitai, for really a wonderful, wonderful traversal of thousands of years of history and so much information. But you did it in such a way that I hope. I wish I were there in your classes when I first started looking into this, because there's so much information and it's hard to just learn names and just get some sense of clarity.
Since we can't help you here, maybe we should go down.
No, well, whatever. Anyway, it's so wonderful to be here, and it's also so great to have to be guests of Tel Aviv University, who provided sort of like a fairy tale backdrop. So those of you that have seen the air conditioning going up, it looks like the fog of some fabulous landscape. So thank you for that too. Now, I think of Wuman as a 21st century Silk Roader. Born in where? Where were you born? Hangzhou, China. Then this is the miracle of 21st century living. We didn't know each other, but we were living in the little town of Winchester, Massachusetts. And I met her by accident in Worcester, Mass. After a concert. And we shared the same Bob's taxi to go to the airport, which is, of course, a very dicey situation to begin with. And this is a modern day connection. And what I love about Wuman is that she's one of the most versatile musicians I know. Whether it's looking at ancient scores from Dunhuang, from the caves of Dunhuang, where Buddhist caves, thousands of caves that in China that from about 800 or 900, she would interpret and really be able to, take it and bring it to life, to playing and commissioning works of Philip Glass or some of our greatest contemporary composers, and so well versed in every part of Chinese traditional music. So will you tell us a little bit about the pipa, which it's a great instrument, and
pipa actually not originated in China, not actually originated from Central Asia, which is related with wood. And my joke was, wood took 2,000 years wood play in this way, and the pipa right now we play hold it straight and use 5 fingers to play. That took 1,000 years to develop as a Chinese instrument.
So the Silk Road as we think of it as the internet of antiquity, except it was just much, much slower. And what would you like to play?
I will play, of course, Chinese traditional piece. It's called White Snow in Spring.
Very much. The next part of the program will be a roundtable about Central Asia today, and I invite my colleagues to come up on the stage and join me. Also have Dr. Brenda Sheffer, who's Research Director of the Caspian Studies Program at Harvard University, and also works at the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Haifa. Professor Yaakov Ro'i, who's Professor of History in our Department of History, and his particular field are Muslims of the former Soviet Union. And also Dr. Moshe Gemmer from the Department of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv University, whose field is, as we always say, is the stands. And we're going to talk a bit about Central Asia today, and I think my role will be simply to ask a few questions about things that interest me and hope that you can provide some of the answers. First thing I want to ask you about is, like anyone who wants to stay up to date and appear knowledgeable about any subject in international affairs, what I did over the weekend was to have a look at The Economist online. And I discovered something very odd, and that is that of all the countries of Central Asia, only one country has a proper country profile in The Economist, and that's Kazakhstan. I also discovered that some countries haven't been mentioned by The Economist in a proper article for years. Turkmenistan hasn't had an article since July 2004, and even Uzbekistan has hardly been mentioned since December 2005. Using this as an index, do you think that the relative lack of interest, even in The Economist, says anything about the level of importance that we give to Central Asia and the West? Would anyone like to answer that? Brenda?
Well, picking up on the theme of the Silk Road, I think that technology has really shaped the rise and falls of the Silk Road. And if we could see that when land routes were really important to us, we see the rise of the Silk Road and its importance. When sea routes became more important, the decline of the Silk Road. And again, now if we took the world's map and we looked at air routes, we could see that there is a new Silk Road, that is actually Central Asia and the Caucasus have become really one of the most important air routes in the world. If you took the map, not of cars, not of boats, but airplanes, you would see that Central Asia and the Caucasus has again become a central region. And anything like, if we took in terms of security, there's only one place in the world where you have three competing organizations, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the CIS sponsored by Russia, and NATO, all in one place. In a place like Kyrgyzstan, you have Russian and American bases and negotiations with Chinese bases. So I think if we were to talk about security and about air travel, we would say that this is, again, a central place in the world.
Anyone else agree?
Well, if you look at it from an economic point of view, the economist's interests are political and economic. Tajikistan was the poorest state in the former Soviet Union, and it still remains a very, very poor state. The strategic interest is now sort of in abeyance, and so that's why I think you don't have an article about Tajikistan. In the case of Turkmenistan, the president of Turkmenistan is, to put it mildly, eccentric, and most of the world economic community and the political community have put Turkmenistan very much on the back burner. The World Bank and other organizations simply find it impossible to work with that country, so that's why I think that hasn't been covered. In the case of Uzbekistan, I was actually surprised to hear that there hasn't been an article since last December, because it's a country that is sensitive and problematic, and I would have thought that there was more coverage of that.
Add to what's just been said, Kyrgyzstan too is also one of the poorest countries. Kyrgyzstan too is also one of the poorest countries of the former Soviet Union, next to Tajikistan, and although it aroused a certain amount of interest last year when the Tulip Revolution took place, that they thought it might perhaps bring some of the color revolutions to Central Asia. In fact, okay. In fact, what has happened in Kyrgyzstan since the Tulip Revolution is that there's been much of the same that happened before, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, and everything else has very much died down. So just wanted to add that little bit about Kyrgyzstan. Kazakhstan, of course, is a major power from the point of view of both oil and natural gas. Okay. Sorry. Kazakhstan is a major power from the point of view of both natural gas and oil. American companies trade there in large quantity, and there's also a lot of natural resources that are important. So I am rather astonished that they haven't had more attention in The Economist than you say.
Just to add one point, Uzbekistan has been in the black book of the IMF and the World Bank for quite a while now because it has refused to carry out reforms they recommended. So I'm not surprised The Economist doesn't display much interest in Uzbekistan.
Brenda mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which represents all the countries of Central Asia apart from our friends in Turkmenistan, presumably because the president is so, as you put it, eccentric, and Russia and China. Do you think that this will become a sort of anti-UN, some sort of organization which will have some effect in uniting these groups, or do you think they'll just continue complaining about American influence in Central Asia? Would anyone like to answer that? Robert?
Actually, I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization holds the possible promise of being very beneficial for Central Asia. It started out mainly as a vehicle for China to make its presence felt in Central Asia. Russia initially was scornful. Uzbekistan refused to join. Later they came on board, and after 2001, there was some cooperation between the United States and the organization. But then, as you pointed out, David, the organization has begun to complain a bit about U.S. presence in Central Asia. But I think not of it as an anti-UN organization, but as a regional organization that could be very useful in dealing with that part of the world. It now includes about a quarter of the world's population. It's not something to be just put aside. And like the OSCE in Western Eurasia, I think the organization has the promise. Right now, yes, we look at it from our vantage over here as mainly in a political context, but there's a lot more to it. And I think it has the possibilities for developing. It's a very new organization. It's only a few years old.
Okay, I'd like to make 2 points on this issue. One, I think we have to get out of thinking of Central Asia. We're not going to use the word great game at all this whole morning, right? We have to get out of the thinking of zero-sum thinking. We're so used to the Soviet period of thinking something that's good for Russia, it's bad for the U.S., something that's bad for the U.S. is good for Russia, and we sort of throw China into that equation as well. So something that has Russian and Chinese overarching component isn't necessarily anti-American and isn't necessarily bad for America, just like Russia and China didn't oppose U.S. bases in Central Asia in order to take care of Afghanistan because it was good for all three countries for the Afghanistan problem to be solved. That being said, I think the growth of the interest in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, its vitality, is quite fed by what we could see really as sort of failures of U.S. policies in Central Asia. If 10 years ago we could have debates in Washington about who lost Russia, I think we're getting close to having debates about who lost Central Asia, and a place where countries were born out of the Soviet Union with such pro-Western feelings and such optimism, and minorities, still something that's very prevalent there, but it's amazing cooperation between minorities. In a sense, we didn't have enough two-way learning. Instead of learning from countries like Kazakhstan about ethnic plurality, we tried to teach that, always be the teachers coming in, teaching them how to change their culture when we could have learned a lot from Central Asia and maybe together actually built a better future for this region. But unfortunately, at this point, some of the growth of the SCO is fed on sort of some anti-American sentiments that are growing from some failed policies in the region.
There's one point that I would like to make, and that is there's quite a lot of tension between Russia and China within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so I'm not quite so sure that it really will be very effective or beneficial when it comes to the crux, when it has to, in fact, deliver the goods.
I'd like to take us back a bit to the Silk Road. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization actually covers most of the Silk Roads, both north and south of the Caspian, Iran being now a candidate member. And one can see actually before all the pipelines and railways and motorways are being completed, one can see the traffic of trucks going very much in the traditional way as it used to be centuries ago when caravans didn't go all the route through but went from one point to another, unloaded, loaded some other goods and went back. And one can see now the volume of traffic, for example, when one goes east-west in Turkey of Iranian trucks going west with the TEH for Tehran on their license. One can see the loads of the many trucks going east to China from Central Asian states, mainly with metal scraps, and going back with goods. So in a way where this organization encompasses the Silk Road, on the other hand, it also inherited, I think, another characteristic of the historical Silk Road, and that's the struggle to control the main road and to prevent others from using the others. One can see it in the struggle for the direction of pipelines, the Baku-Jehan pipeline, for example. And in this case, the Russian-Chinese, I think, rivalry is also manifest.
Yes, I'd just like to add on to what Professor Roy said. If you look at Central Asia in its historical perspective, the dynamic has been of a tension great at times and lesser at other between Russia and China. And even though now they're cooperating and for the next decade or two we can see a symbiotic relationship with Russia as an energy producer and China growing very, very rapidly, needing all of that. But the basic tensions are there. Russia has certainly revived its CIS organizations, even though it has joined the SCO. And I think in the long run, those tensions will again come to the fore. Kazakhstan has historically come to be where it is because they sought assistance from the Russians against the Chinese. And even though today Kazakhstan is very cleverly balancing between the two, I think Professor Roy was quite right when he said that in the future or even now those tensions are still there under the surface.
I just wonder, though, there are some things that unite all these governments. I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union also led to a resurgence in Islam, and Islam of an, you might say, an alien variety. There's also talk about Wahhabi missionaries coming from Saudi Arabia. The Chinese face problems with the Uyghurs, who it's even said that there are some Uyghurs in Guantanamo and making alliances with the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and even the Taliban. So, I mean, this is a problem that all these governments face. I mean, what do you think they should do about this? Is there some kind of common policy that might be useful?
That, of course, was the official raison d'etre, the reason why the Shanghai Five, as it were, at the beginning came into being, because of Muslim extremism or the fear of Muslim terror. All governments have in common that they are very much, I would say, inflating the fear of Islamic terror in order to justify, to give legitimacy to their repressive measures against Islam of all sorts. And they are, by so doing, they are encouraging the very danger that they are trying, as it were, to avoid. And so I think here that this question of Islamic terror is something that has to be very carefully analyzed, and the governments will do well to analyze it somewhat better in order to understand the implications of what they themselves are doing, and in that way exacerbating the perils that they are trying to repress.
If I may put it a bit extremely, it's now bon ton to fight Islamic extremism. Everyone is fighting Islamic extremism to be counted on the side of the goodies. In Abkhazia, the Georgians fight Islamic extremism, even though 80% of the Abkhazians are Christian. In Serbia, in Bosnia, we had the Serbs fighting Islamic extremism, etc. So I would say all the governments, Russia in Central Asia, in Tajikistan, in Chechnya, Uzbekistan, China in Xinjiang, all of them actually are exaggerating the danger of Islamic extremism, not only for internal purposes, but also for external purposes, to be on the good side in the international community.
I would separate between rise in religion and rise in extremism and violence. Yes, there is a Islamic resurgence, or in general religious resurgence in Central Asia with the freedom of these countries. On the other hand, we're not necessarily seeing widespread phenomena of religious violence. And I think the fact that the Central Asian states have all chosen, and Azerbaijan and the Caucasus have chosen to have complete separation between religion and state, no official role for religion in its constitutions, I think it tells you a lot about the orientation of these regimes. And in fact, I think one of the reasons why it's so great that in at least 3 of our universities we study Central Asia and Israel is that it's very important for the Israelis to realize that most of the Islamic world doesn't have an anti-Israeli propensity, isn't very interested in the conflict here. Jews fared better in Central Asia than they did in Christian Ukraine and Russia. And there's really been no signs of any sort of xenophobia or anti-Semitism despite the great challenges that these countries have gone through in the past decade. That being said, and I think you were very correct in making this differentiation between phenomena in Central Asia and from outside, there are a lot of Islamic forces from outside who see Central Asia sort of the soft underbelly, these secular Muslims, very open to the West, supporting U.S. policies in the region, and that this is the place where really they can grab a piece and undermine a lot of American policies and these regimes themselves. And I think there are true threats from outside, and unfortunately, really the only U.S. policy prescription for this is democratization, which democratization and democracy is a really good thing, and in the end of the day, it might even be a good way when it's in place to actually deal with threats of different kinds. But the process of democratization is a most destabilizing process, and it actually creates more security threats and creates more opportunity for security threats, and the process of democratization isn't going to bring security to Central Asia. They need democracy, but they also need security, and democracy is dependent on security.
Yes, I agree with you. I'd like to go back, though, and kind of state what's inherent in what everyone has said, which is that there are very important social and political problems in all of the countries of Central Asia. And the regimes that have replaced the Soviet Union basically are continuances of the Soviet Union, so they don't provide the answers. And what people are doing, they're looking for an answer. And typically, when people look for an answer, they go back to what they knew before, which in much of Central Asia, and particularly in Uzbekistan, is something that's Islamic in nature. What they know about democracy, what they know about Western forms of government, all came through the Soviet Union and before that the Russian Empire. So they're retreating to their previous experience and looking for an answer there. But that doesn't mean that the problems aren't real. The problems are real, and the answers being provided by the governments in the region are, in fact, the answers that were provided by the Soviet Union. They don't solve the problems of the region. I agree with you, Brenda, on the problems of democratization in the former Soviet Union. United States policies have been limited, I would say. There wasn't enough attention, there wasn't enough money put in, and they do create problems because the regimes that are there feel threatened by these processes. They see the flower revolutions, and the governments in all of the Central Asian countries in the last year have very much tightened up their policies, shutting down non-governmental organizations, not allowing diplomats access to people. They're very much afraid of what's going on, and they've been very open about that and blame the United States and behind them the European allies for trying to overturn their regimes.
Do you think the other regimes should be worried about the changing government in Kyrgyzstan, which is the only government that managed to replace the fellas from the early 90s? Is this a worry for them, or is the situation there so different that the other rulers can rest easy?
I'm talking too much. I think they're very uneasy. Even though Kyrgyzstan, as you pointed out, had a revolution, and they have, you did, I think, they have more of the same, unfortunately. It wasn't the same as the revolution in the other countries. But certainly, Tajikistan could be very worried because it's a parallel situation, and in fact, after the end of the civil war, had maybe more of a promise of developing into a truly democratic society. Uzbekistan is very worried because their economic house of cards can fall at any moment, and all of the governments are threatened by dissonant voices.
First thing, we could say something quite interesting, that the only two post-Soviet leaders to fall by coups along the Silk Road are Shevardnadze and Akayev, the ones who are the most benign and liberal and open of the two leaders on the Silk Road. So it's quite interesting that these are the ones that end up with the getting the coups. And second, I think from the Akayev, from the Kyrgyzstan example, we can see that, a coup does not necessarily bring democracy, end of corruption, liberalization. A coup can also be just the replacement of one elite by another elite. So we should look at it's not the means that's interesting. It's not necessarily the fact that the street did it that makes it democracy. What makes it democracy is about institutions, about rule of law. It's something much bigger, and sometimes we don't always differentiate. But I say yes, I think that the leaders of the region are taking this example with concern, especially because the Fergana Valley, which Kyrgyzstan sits on, it's multi-ethnic area. 4 states of Central Asia meet there, and of course, it's the center of culture of the region and arts, but it's also a center where you really can't set good borders there, and one thing that happens in one part of Fergana Valley impacts the whole region.
As you said, Ambassador Finn, all the governments are worried about what happened in Kyrgyzstan, and they're all tightened security measures. And okay, well, I have to become emeritus. And I think, on the other hand, that there's not very much danger of things happening in the other countries because the security forces there are very strong. The rulers are very strong. Everyone said after Andijan last year in May that Karimov would fall almost at once, and there's not been any sign of anything serious happening there since then. They have taken more repressive measures against Islam. You've said, Brenda, that in all these states, religion is separated from the state, but that is only formally so. In fact, religion is very much subjected to the state. All religious associations, all mosques have to be registered with the Minister of Justice, and the ones who aren't are not allowed to operate. So if that is separation of state and religion, I buy it, but I don't really think anyone in the West would consider that separation of state from religion. And what happened in Kyrgyzstan, which is of course a secular state, as of all the other states of Central Asia formerly, can happen elsewhere, but it's not going to make any serious difference. It will make a difference to the people who are sitting in power, but it will not make any difference, in my view, to anything from the point of view of the political philosophy or the political regime that controls these countries.
Brenda, you mentioned the Fergana Valley, and it's a place we always hear about. It's the real border, isn't it, between the states, the Turkish speakers to the north and the Persian speakers to the south. You've got 8 million people, and it's not only a great cultural center, but it was the center of violence last May, where maybe up to 1,000 demonstrators were killed. In what sense is this valley a kind of microcosm? It's very poor now, but it's still... do you think it's a kind of microcosm of Central Asia? As you put it, it's the center of the pinwheel around which all the other states revolve. Can you say something about the border as well? The border is in the wrong place. It should be there, shouldn't it?
Well, I think Central Asia is also a really interesting place to think about borders in a more abstract sphere, because one, for instance, we tend in the West to try to organize the borders of states and nations, ethnicities. In Central Asia, they would have no idea why we're talking about why the political borders have to align with ethnicity borders. I think of a time when I was an election observer in the border between Kazakhstan and China, a very multi-ethnic area, and I was so impressed how people could go looking for a voting booth. They didn't have to look for exact law that says here Russian speaker, here Uyghur speaker, here Kazakh speaker. They could figure it out in a very natural way. And if someone turned to them in Russian, they answer in Russian. Someone turns to them in Kazakh, they answer in Kazakh. And again, I think instead of like in Canada where you need a law and on every piece of toothpaste and can of peas you have to put French, and and forcefully, I think the sort of the more natural way that Central Asians deal with the connection between state and ethnicity could really teach us a lot. So I'm not sure that it's so necessary, actually, that we have to worry so much about where the political borders go. And actually, I wrote an article once for the Christian Science Monitor about how peace has broken out in Central Asia. You know, we always write about wars, but when peace breaks out, we never write about it, which was the border delimitation between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. They have over 500 places where the border could be contested between them. No ethnic way to sort it out, no historical way, because it's such a multi-ethnic way. And the two leaders sat there, Karimov and Nazarbayev, sat in a summit meeting like two little boys with marbles and said, you take this village, I take that village, you take this village, I take that village, and signed an agreement that just basically demarcated the border. A thing that we tried that in the Middle East, it would have taken a couple wars, a lot of terrorist incidents, and still we wouldn't have demarcated the border.
To demur, Brenda, when I was in Tajikistan, the Uzbeks did not have a peaceable settlement with the Tajiks on the border because they basically think Tajikistan shouldn't exist. And so they just arbitrarily started mining places along the border, resulting in the killing of lots of cows and sheep, and unfortunately a number of people too. But the thing about the borders there is that all the borders within the former Soviet Union are a tribute to the mad geniuses of Soviet cartography, who just placed borders in all kinds of arbitrary places to divide people and also for other reasons, so that it still now is very difficult to go from, example, from Tashkent to the borders between American states.
The borders between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are problematic as well as the ones between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and certainly between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. So it's not a simple matter at all. It's also, besides the mining that you mentioned between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, there's a lot of problem with wares and smuggling and contraband and hashish and so on and so forth. It's going back and forth and bribing border guards, and the whole thing is still very much, I think, in flux. Even if between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan it is relatively quiet, the rest of the borders seem problematic, and also between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan there have been incidents with smuggling and so on and so forth.
To go to Fergana Valley, I think borders are, of course, of major importance. Now, for us to understand, Fergana Valley has a density of population similar to Bangladesh, to Java, to Upper Egypt, with very few economic resources and very limited ability to leave the area and to go to the big cities. Now, to add to these social, economic and other problems, we have these meandering borders between three republics, which make it difficult for any of them to control its own territory, not to say the borders to be crossed, etc. And that's, I think, the lack of control contributes a lot to it being a center of problems.
I heard a very surprisingly interesting paper from someone who came from Berlin who talked about culture wars in the Fergana Valley, that they in fact were compelled to speak one language or another. Is there any kind of significance to that, do you think?
Again, I see Central Asia, in terms of school systems, cultural autonomy, I see it as one of the more, again, the place we could look at for the example in the West and not the opposite. And I think also identity, also in the West, we tend to view ethnic or religious identity as primary identity, but for many people in Central Asia, or even people, probably in a room full of Israelis, if you ask where your grandparents came from, they probably didn't say Poland, but they might have said Radom. And if you ask where they came from in North Africa, they probably didn't say Morocco, they said Casablanca or Fez, talking about city identity. And I think that city identity is still really relevant in Central Asia, and that it doesn't matter as much what is the language that people are speaking, because most of them are multilingual. Even if you look at marriage patterns, people in Samarkand, for instance, Tajiks and Uzbeks will marry each other, but but Tajiks from Samarkand won't marry Tajiks from Bukhara. So I think, I'm not so sure. I'm sure there's a lot of people who would like to turn this area into cultural wars, but and I'm still optimistic, I guess.
I should just say that My family always says they come from Radun, but if you said they came from Poland, they'd be very insulted. Russia.
Yes, Brenda is quite right. My head local employee in the embassy in Tajikistan, of course, spoke in Tajik, which is Farsi, and said he was a Tajik. And then I went to Bukhara and visited with his brother who spoke Uzbek and told me he was an Uzbek.
Well, we have things go both ways. I'd say probably apart from Tajiks and Uzbeks, which is very difficult to differentiate, even for themselves in many cases. I'd say the big divide is between the ex-nomads and ex-settled people. Well, I remember being in Kyrgyzstan and being told by many people that the events in Osh, still in the late Soviet period, were initiated by Uzbeks, and the Uzbeks actually played Islam in their nationalisms, calling themselves the good Muslims and the Kyrgyz the bad Muslims. But the interesting thing is that I was told by a young archaeologist who told me, well, you know, once we used to be nomads and they used to live in the villages. And whenever we came to the villages, they used to cheat us in the market. But we got even if they dared to get out of the villages because they would be brought back without their head.
I'll ask you something about American involvement. The Americans were asked to vacate the K2 base in Uzbekistan, and in Kyrgyzstan, the Americans were allowed to stay, but then the Russians opened the base next door. I mean, what do you think the Americans want? It is odd to have American bases on what was formerly the Soviet Union. I mean, apart from the metaphorical beauty of that, is there another point? Robert, you don't necessarily have to answer.
Well, obviously, if you were sitting in Moscow, you get nervous at the sight of American bases going up all across what used to be your country. The bases are there, according to the American government, to fight the war in Afghanistan, and this is what the SCO, the Shanghai movement, says, well, fine, but how about a timetable of withdrawal? So obviously they're nervous about it. The Americans were asked to leave the base in Karshakhanabad after they criticized the events in Andijan. There's also a subtext of payment for the base, but I won't get into all of that. So yeah, obviously the Russians and the Chinese are nervous about having American bases in Central Asia, and the Americans say that the bases are there for the war in Afghanistan, but now we've also made base agreements with Bulgaria, and there are apparently some American military people also present in Azerbaijan, but nobody knows about that. So something's going on, yeah.
In Kyrgyzstan, it's just a rent disagreement, though, isn't it?
Apparently, that's what it is. They want a very high rent for the base. I've heard a figure of $200 million. And I think perhaps the American government thinks that they should be helping in the war against terrorism and not looking to make a quick profit.
From the perspective of the states of the region, if you were sitting next to Russia, China, India, Turkey, and Iran, you would want to pull in as many superpowers as possible so that they all had an interest in somehow of your survivability. If you look at in Israel, it's standing operating procedure for the army is for the army to be able to hold out for 24 hours until the reserves come. In Kyrgyzstan, they're only hoping for 12 hours. That's it. They don't have a lot of ambitions, so it's clear that they want to bring in all the powers. I would say from the U.S. perspective, in terms of what are their intentions, I know that most of the American bases in Central Asia, they've built bowling alleys, so I think it's a sign they're here to stay.
Anything to add about the bowling question?
The point from Karimov's angle, of course, was naturally that he did want to get American support for his repression and his anti-democratic regime. And so, as you said, as soon as there was criticism of what he did in Andijan, that, as it were, put an end to the American military presence. But Karimov has spent the whole time playing between the Americans and the Russians. And I don't think that this is necessarily the end of the tale, because I don't see that he's going to necessarily go along with the Russians for a long time. So I think there is every likelihood that the Americans will be coming back. Same with Nazarbayev, I think he's definitely left a lot of lines open to Washington should the situation arise in which it might be expedient for him to bring the Americans in a similar way.
Do you know what? Okay.
Yes, you remind me of what I heard many times when I was in Azerbaijan years earlier. The Azeris all said, "We want America to be our friend because you're so powerful and you're so far away."
We have time for a few more questions. One thing I've always been interested in is you hear people saying a lot that the NGOs like the Peace Corps, where you of course served, and the Open Society of the Soros Foundation, that what they're really doing is fostering regime change under the guise of opening up democracy and civil society and so on. Do you think that's a fair claim, or is it an exaggeration?
Okay, firstly, I would think we should be really careful about assuming that anything that's non-governmental is necessarily good. I mean, George Soros, he's a very, very powerful world businessman, and he creates a foundation, and I'm sure many of us have been supported to different elements of his foundation, right? But still, in the end of the day, it's a businessman who has an interest in a lot of not only open society but open markets to George Soros. And I think so we should be very careful that not only any NGO is necessarily something that has a very, clean agenda or only people-oriented agenda. Also, one aspect of civil society, also it can also be aspects of xenophobia. If we think, for instance, we have 1 million Azerbaijani refugees, Shiite Muslim refugees, in a conflict from 10 years ago, not from 50 years ago, not from generations ago. And they haven't had one act of terror to call attention to their world plight. And one of the reasons is that their leaders have not let sort of nationalist organizations, try to turn this into a very a rallying card for politics in Azerbaijan, and also sort of to try to keep this element under lid. So you could say, yes, it's kind of anti-democratic, right? On the other hand, there are these other sides of the coin that actually have allowed some stability in the region. But I think that we have to be very careful because a number of these organizations, they do promote a variety of agendas, which isn't not only democratization.
NGOs?
We have to understand that there's really no civil society in Central Asia, and therefore the NGOs do have a role that they have been playing, and they have been to an extent exploiting. And therefore, I think it's very clear if you look at some of the human rights complaints that have been getting through to the West, they've almost all come through the NGOs and through representatives of the NGOs, usually local representatives of the NGOs who have had more access to Western reporters and have been able to get things through to them that otherwise in government-controlled media they wouldn't have been able to bring through to the West. And so I think the role that the NGOs have been playing is important, and of course it is something that the governments do have to worry about. It doesn't mean that the NGOs are necessarily reporting correct things. I think a lot of the human rights complaints that have been reported in the Western media have been exaggerated. Just as government media exaggerate one way, I think the NGO reportage exaggerates the other way. I think the truth is definitely somewhere in the middle. If we talk about for example, the victims in Andijan last year, one very scientific, very academic report that was done by a British-based academic did confirm that the government report of less than 200 killed was probably correct.
The number usually given is 1,000. That's right. Moshe, NGOs?
Just to perhaps continue, one of the problems, I think, of the West, of the media, of the NGOs, is that they look in a black and white spectrum on the regimes, and since they designate the regimes as oppressive, dictatorial, etc., then automatically everyone who is against the regime is perceived as democratic. Now, usually, as we know, the opposition is very democratic when it complains against the regime. When it comes to power, it continues the same practices.
As Brenda says, all NGOs are not necessarily doing good things. Some of them are very self-serving. But there's also the fact that a lot of them are doing things that are sort of politically indifferent. They're not, in fact, politically active at all. And Tajikistan is a case in point. During the Civil War, the all-encompassing Soviet system of government completely fell apart, and literally hundreds of organizations stepped in to take over those things, organizing food plans, schools, medical facilities, maintaining libraries, doing all of the services that the Soviet state had provided. And after they had their compromise in 1998 in Tajikistan, and the government came in that actually included some representatives of the Islamic Party, that those organizations maintained their status. And even a few years later, when the government was starting to revitalize itself, and then the commissars of the former regime, who were still very much around, wanted to start to shut down these organizations, it was the president who stepped in and said, no, let them do this, because they're filling a need that we can't afford to fill in our society. And still in Tajikistan, there's relatively a greater presence of NGOs, even though they too have clamped down on them, particularly on their political aspect. But there are other things that they do. And the whole thing is kind of a philosophical problem in that the Soviet Union, of course, was an all-encompassing state that did everything for its citizens, and then all of a sudden it wasn't able to do those things anymore. And all of us who have been in the former Soviet Union, I'm sure many of you have seen the tragedy of older people who work their whole lives, people like us who were professors and government officials, and all of a sudden we're left with pensions of $2 or $3 a month because the state couldn't provide for them. So these organizations in many places are trying to fill that gap, but all the governments are uncomfortable with that because the people who are in the government still want to do everything for them. So it's a problem that, yes, has very much its political aspect, but it's a wider problem than that.
The question is related to the size of the country and travel between them. Would anyone like to answer that?
I would just say Mr. Yo-Yoma's question is excellent about the travel in the region, because the infrastructures there tell you a lot about some of the problems and why we haven't really gone from Pax Moscow to Pax Americana completely or something in the region, is that if you want to fly basically in between many of the Silk Road cities, you either have to fly, well, first thing, especially if you want to survive the flights, you have to fly to Istanbul, to Moscow, to Beijing. A lot of time, I mean, you have some routes, but usually the easier way to travel in between the region and air travel is actually to go out to a Western country or to a major power, and then to go back into the region. And this is one of the tragedies now of sort of this transfer from the Soviet Union, is that still the infrastructures have not been completely brought in. But one of sort of the revolutions, and I think one of the amazing parts of, let's say, West European and American policies in the region, if this used to be sort of the backwaters, landlocked area, cut off only through Moscow or Beijing into this region. We are seeing now major road highways, railroad traffic being built, and you can sit in the Fergana Valley, the same valley we mentioned, and see road signs, how many kilometers to Warsaw, how many kilometers to Berlin, how many kilometers to Paris, and it does say something about the mentality that really infrastructures will allow the people to reconnect, and it's not enough about just what you feel or what you care, but you need those infrastructures to meet again. I would say similar to, for instance, like cities like Jerusalem and Amman that can sit 100 kilometers from each other and no ties between the peoples, no exchanges. Sometimes the infrastructures can limit people and limit a lot of logical connections.
About the size?
The geography lesson, as the Turks say, whatever I tell you will be a lie. So I rely on my colleagues to correct me as that when I veer off the path of truth. Kazakhstan is by far the largest country. It's about the size of Western Europe, I believe, with a population of, say, 15 million. Is that right? Mountains on the southern border, mostly vast plains, enormous energy resources. Uzbekistan is south of that. It has the largest population, I believe, about 25 million, and sees itself as the prime state in Central Asia. Next door, excuse me, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are both mainly mountainous, small populations. Tajikistan is about 6 million, I think, half divided by mountain ranges, so that you cannot get from the southern part of the country to the northern part of the country for more than 6 months of the year without going through Uzbekistan. Kyrgyzstan is enormously beautiful and mountainous, with a population of 3 or 4 million, and very few natural resources. And the other one is Turkmenistan in the west, which is mostly desert, very large natural gas supplies, and a really crazy government. About 4 million people. Yeah.
Even though we think of what geographers would define Central Asia as those 5 states, but I think since we're here celebrating cultural works, I think we have to would include also in our analysis that Azerbaijan, which is technically in the Caucasus, but in terms of an economic region, infrastructure region, cultural region, Azerbaijan is 8 million people, Shiite Muslims bordering Iran, and Iran itself has 25 million Azerbaijanis on the other side of the border. Pretty soon you're going to hear Alim Gasimov, who is the only man who's ever made me cry when he sings in Baku. And I think Azerbaijan has very friendly relations also with Israel, and I think, again, when Israelis are thinking about the Muslim world, if there's such a thing, the political problems, knowing that there's a Shiite Muslim country bordering Iran with very friendly ties to Israel and its Jewish communities, I think it teaches us a lot. And they had a very good first U.S. ambassador that opened their embassy there.
Well, just one last thing I wanted to ask. If there's anyone who would like to make a confession about how they became interested in such a fascinating subject, this is something about which I envy you all. Is there anyone who has a particular how they could get into such a thing?
It's a perfect lead-in to the next session. My academic work is in Turkish literature, and actually I first wanted to study Azeri literature, and my first and basically my only academic article was on the epic elements in Dedi Korkut, which you'll hear about next. So when I went and opened the embassy in Baku, there were newspaper headlines saying, "World-famous scholars opens American embassy."
Okay, well, you asked for secret stories. In 1982, I had the pleasure of going to the Soviet Union to visit Jewish refuseniks at the time, and at the time it was quite non-extraordinary type of activity. And I reached the Central Asian republics and Azerbaijan, and I found their Jewish communities that while they talked about Soviet repression, what they always focused on was how wonderful their Muslim neighbors were and how for centuries they've lived together. And the Jewish mahalla, the Jewish neighborhood, lives in great relationships with the Muslim mahalla next door. And I said, this is something special, and coming back to Israel, decided that's something that should be watched. Only got to really watch it when I was in my army service, and I saw this CIA, thank you for your good maps, ethnic maps of the Soviet Union, and I noticed that there were this green that showed the Soviet Turkmen, and then a little bit of that green also in Afghanistan, and then there was a red that showed the Tajiks, and there was a little bit of the Soviet Tajikistan, a little bit of those Tajiks also in Afghanistan, but then suddenly I saw this huge amount of blue connecting Soviet Azerbaijan and Iran, and realized that there might be these political borders, but there's something else going on in the ethnic borders, and Professor Ooi was kind enough to agree to be a doctoral dissertation advisor.
Shall I spare you the confessions?
I too started with Soviet Jewish history, and then I moved on to Soviet Islam, and I wanted to compare the way the Soviets are related to Judaism and to Islam, and then I did a major work on Islam and the Soviet Union, and that naturally brought me into Central Asia, which was the most important Muslim area of the former Soviet Union.
Well, it's difficult for me to answer. It's like asking me why did I fall in love with my wife?
That was definitely a confession. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to my colleagues, Ambassador Robert Finn, Dr. Brenda Schaffer, Dr. Moshe Gemer, and Professor Yaakov Ro'i. And now we have the musical interlude for which we've been waiting.
Sorry for the interruption. All the people who are traveling to Jerusalem with the Board of Governors trip, after the musical interlude, please, the buses are leaving. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank this panel for being so wonderful in terms of giving us a kind of a picture of Central Asia. Can I give you a non-scholarly response from a microcosm of a trip, of actually a number of trips? We were traveling with the Silk Road Ensemble to Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. From Kyrgyzstan, I called my daughter. I'm married to an American, so my daughter is, has certain features that look very much like the Kyrgyz. So I called her and said, Emily, I found your country. If you ever feel you have an identity crisis, go to Kyrgyzstan because everybody looks like you. And in fact, a number of our members in the ensemble were walking around, and immediately people asked them for directions on how to go from one place to another. And Wuman, I think, was asked, among other things. But Central Asia is, the big takeaway is, it's huge. I think it was just for people that have never gone and who are asking questions about the stands, and it is so huge and so different in many ways. I think that a recommendation, if there's a DVD called The Weeping Camel. I don't know if you've seen it. It actually, life with a family, yurt. It's very sweet. It's almost no dialogue, but it gives you a sense of the nomadic life, of which I think Kazakhstan had for so long. Would you agree? I don't know. And so even though it's in Mongolia, it's the same idea. In Kyrgyzstan, we met an extraordinary performer, and actually Manasji Rizbek, who recites from oral tradition an epic that is about 500,000 lines long. And it is, you want to talk to any Kyrgyz person, I think, about Manas, it is really part of their culture, of their religion, and in many ways deals with the natural world, I think. And again, I'm not from a scholarly point of view, but we did work with him, and it's kind of an extraordinary experience. And even though Kazakhstan is most Russian in many ways, I think it feels, from the musical part, lots of conservatories, very well-trained people. Same thing in Baku. You have strong musical traditions, and one of the great musical traditions in Azerbaijan is the Mugam. And the Mugam, to me, the Mugam trio is the equivalent of the string quartet. It's Alim. When we first heard him, I have never heard Alim do anything other than 120% of what he is. I think he takes life in his hands and just goes with it to the very nth degree. And I think I completely agree with you. It's totally transporting. So here is Alim Kazimov, his friend Ralph playing the kemanche, and Ali Asghar playing the tar related to the guitar, dutar, sitar. And please welcome. Sorry, it's just trying to...
qatar tuti şirin süxənləri öz nəğməmizlə zinəti sərvi çəmənləri güzdülər təranəmizin həsrətin çəkir bağı vətəndə bülbül xoş nəğməzənlərin Vay bir kimsə bilməyir nə xərabat ilərdənik meyxanələr misafirindik əlləri şu qəmi سگی گزلی خوی بلم شو گمیز حقیقی گزلی خوی مستدیر عشق عالمinde Yusuf gül pireheller şehit aşk meydanına dadı da gül gül kefenleri Cavid həmişə xalqımızın xatirindədir Vahid o yoxsa ruhi ilə həmvətənləri Dağların başını kışladan Yar yarın görmez rengi Gel gözüm gel mara Güzelim gel mara Gel dilde geldim senin Ne güzel ne güzel ne güzel Oğlum ne güzel ne güzel Ağlasın savsın mesut Eller oynasın Ağlasın savsın etron Eller oynasın Ağustos
Many thanks to my colleagues and to Mr. Lim Kasimo. Çok beğendik.
Okay.
Do you want me to try?
One more time, please. Anybody who's coming on the Jerusalem trip of the Board of Governors, we are leaving right now. Thank you.
We're now ready for the last session in this very interesting conference. The last session will be chaired by Professor Amy Singer, who is the professor of Ottoman history at the Department of Middle Eastern and African history in this university. Professor Singer.
Good morning to you all. Welcome to the third stop along the Silk Road this morning, entitled At the End of the Road, Turkish Literature and Music. Now, our speakers are both going to be talking about the modern Turkish Republic, but in fact, Turkic languages exist all along the Silk Road, and from popular culture, probably one of the more accessible examples to you is the film Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. The bandit character in that film sings his songs in Turkish. So, our first speaker is Professor Robert Finn, who bears remarkable resemblance to Ambassador Robert Finn from the fascinating roundtable discussion on Central Asia. This Robert Finn is currently professor of Ottoman and Turkish literature in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, where he also earned his PhD. He is the author of several works on Turkish literature, including a book entitled The Early Turkish Novel, published both in English and in Turkish. And he is the author of poems, articles, and translations that have appeared in the United States, Turkey, France, and Pakistan. Please, Robert.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amy, for that nice introduction. But in fact, I'm not going to talk about the Turkish Republic. I'm going to speak about something from the Silk Road. But it's also something they read in the Turkish Republic. And this whole thing has been a very nice lead, and everything is integrated. We're all inspired. Yo-Yo Ma has just returned from Azerbaijan, and I didn't know that when I selected my topic for this morning. And I also didn't know that we were going to hear these wonderful singers, and it's only because of my great diplomatic control that I did not get up and dance while they were singing. But that's exactly the kind of singing that, in a way, I'll be talking about. Where does our story take place? When does our story take place? It takes place in the mountains, in a place that is neither here nor there, that is neither east nor west, where Tanra, the Sky King, has become Allah, the Lord of creation, where Bayandir Khan, the King of Kings, has spread his silken damascene tent upon the earth and raised a great awning against the sky, where he has spread 1,000 silk carpets on the earth. It takes place, as Dedi Korkut tells us, when the strands of the wind trail across the sky, when the meadowlark sings her song, when the long-bearded Persian calls to prayer, when the Bedouin horses neigh to their lords, when one can see twixt black and white, when day strokes the lovely breasts of the rugged mountains, when the warriors and the heroes are all still asleep. It is the time and place of Dedi Korkut, the poet, the shaman, the wise advisor. His book tells the tales of Bayandir Khan, the Turkic tribes that roamed across the steppes of Central Asia, and their enemies. There are 12 tales, their origins clouded by time, and still alive among the peoples of the area today, from Central Asia to Anatolia and Armenia, Georgia, and Iran. The stories are classics of the Silk Road. They are the national treasures of Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, and contain within them strands from all the cultures of the areas they encompass. The Book of Dedi Korkut is known in the West from manuscripts in Dresden and in the Vatican. In the East, it is known from the heart. The stories seem to have first taken place between the 9th and 11th centuries of our era, along the banks of the Sirdarya in eastern Turkestan, at a time when the Oghuz, the Turkish tribal grouping that would eventually create the Ottoman Empire, was forming itself as a separate entity. They were establishing themselves as warrior groups, skilled in raids on neighboring tribes and more sedentary groups. The stories and the tales are meant to glorify this life of raids and valor on the edge of the settled world. The Oghuz tribes in these tales moved west, then south, entering the lands of Iran, what is now Turkmenistan, and then the Caucasus. Later groups moved into the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia. The tales were carried with the tribes as they moved west, but contain words from Mongol, Persian, Arabic, and all the different dialects of Central Asia. As the tribes settled down in the southern Caucasus and northern Iran, the geography and culture of the mountainous west permeated the migratory culture of the steppe tribes. But the tales are still replete with personal and place names that refer to their origins in Turkestan, what is now called Central Asia. Castles and cities appear in the text, although the heroes and heroines live their lives mostly in their white, black, and red tents, raiding those around and engaging in heroic displays of strength and emotion. The texts as we have them seem to have been written down in the second half of the 16th century, while the stories themselves remained alive in popular culture. The language of the texts is the musical dialect of Azerbaijan, full of repetitions and alliterations, the language of a people close to nature. Wise Dedi Korkut tells us, "Only the deer know where the grasslands are. Only the wild donkey knows where the green grass is. Only the camel knows the different trails. Only the fox knows the scent of the 7 streams. Only the lark knows when the caravan passes in the night." It is a world in which women are as prominent as men. In fact, the most important figures in several of the tales are women. One of the most formidable is Burla Hatun, who figures in 2 of the tales. We learn her personality very clearly. When her husband comes back from the hunt without their son who has been captured, she complains. You went as two and you came as one. Where's my kid? Where's the son I found in the dark of the night? My only baby is gone. My heart is on fire. Shortly afterwards, she says, I sent the waterman to the dry, dry creeks. I sent donations to the black-clothed monks. I turned and took care of my neighbors. When I saw them hungry, I fed them. When I saw them naked, I clothed them. I got this son with hardship and prayer. Only give me news of the boy, Kazan. Tell it to me. If you don't, I will soon curse you in words of flame. Later, not trusting him to win their son back, she saddles up with 40 virgins and takes after him. And when she meets him, gives him a piece of her mind. Why do you sit there across from me, my brave one, weeping and crying? Why do you remind me of days gone by? Have you gone senile? What's happened to you? Take to your sword. I'm here, Kazan. In another tale, the spirited Banu Chichek only agrees to marry after the hero has won over her in horse racing, arrow shooting, and wrestling. Then she goes through many trials, including waiting for him for 16 years while he is held captive. Her parents-in-law sing her a poem of praise at the end, surely an unusual occurrence in any literature. Part of it reads, May the black mountains across from us be pasture for you, my little bride. May the cold, cold water be drink for you, my little bride. Although most of the stories have their origin in the past of the Oghuz, at least two of them are adaptations of myths from the West. The Homeric story of Cyclops appears in the book of Dedi Korkut as the story of Tepegöz, from which it spread into Georgian and Iranian literature as well. In this version, Tepegöz engages in an outraged dialogue as the hero Basat outwits him several times, and not just by hiding under a sheep in a cave. In the end, he kills Tepegöz with the monster's own sword, leading Dedi Korkut to appear and sing, When you come to the Black Mountain, may it dissolve before you. When you come to the raging stream, may it let you pass. The other classical text that is entered into the book of Dedi Korkut is that of Admetus and Alcestis, in which Admetus is condemned to death unless someone will die for him. His parents refuse, and in the end, only his wife offers to die for him. In this version, the story of crazy Dumrul, Dedi Dumrul, Dumrul wrestles with the angel of death to save the life of a young man and winds up threatened with losing his own. In the end, it is his wife who offers to die for him. She tells him, What is it you say, my strong ram, my young Shah, whom I loved at first sight and gave all of my heart, whom I gave my sweet lips to be kissed, whom I slept with on the same pillow and loved? What shall I do with the black mountains yonder when you are no longer here? Should I take my flock there, let my grave be there too. Should I sip your cool springs, let my blood run like water. Should I spend your gold coins, let them be for my shroud. Moved by her words, Dumrul prays to God to either kill them both or let them both live. And God, moved by his prayer, gives them 140 years of life. To punish Dumrul's parents for their selfishness, he takes their lives instead. There are also other elements of classical mythology in the tales. There are two instances of children being raised and protected by animals, a myth that stretches from ancient Rome all the way to Mongolia and the founding myth of the Turkic people in the valley of Ergenekon. One story contains a version of the legend of swan fairies, a widespread myth that we are all familiar with in its variation in the opera Swan Lake. The Cyclops story has its roots in the East as well as the West. appearing in a version in Indian mythology and, as we learned this morning, in China. And it is easy to see behind some of the actions and conversations in the tales the shadows of pre-Islamic culture and the strong influence of Central Asian shamanism. The figure of Dedi Korkut himself is his transition figure, a shaman who communicates with the forces of nature as well as the Islamic God. The latter is almost always referred to in these tales by the Turkish name of Tanrı, the God of heaven. Dedi Korkut appears at the end of each tale to give an encomium, sometimes a joyous poem, but more often a caution. He appears as an advisor in the poems, but is always the semi-mystical overseer of the action. One of his functions is to make the reader aware that the tales are just that, tales that should be viewed as lessons for life. Characters in the tales communicate with the forces of nature, most clearly in the case of Salur Kazan, who undergoes what is clearly recognizable as a shamanistic journey. He first addresses water, stating, "Water has seen the face of God. Let me talk to the water." Kazan then talks in turn to the water, a wolf, a dog, and a shepherd. He realizes in each case that he cannot expect help from them, even from the shepherd who has successfully fought off the infidels. In the end, Salur Kazan must of course fight his own battle, as the tale makes the point that each of us is alone and must win his own way, his own salvation. The tales are heroic and epic, which means that the characters are larger than life, fight against enormous odds, and are full of bravado and noble sentiment. It is the function of such tales to inspire and awe us, and the Dedi Korkut tales amply fulfill this function. They reflect a society that is still pre-urban, living in tents, hunting and fighting. The relations are personal and emotional. The most surprising thing for a Western reader would no doubt be the important place of women, who are capable of fighting alongside the men and assertive of their rights and demands. As one of the women says, "One end of the raiding party is yours, the other is mine." These are certainly not the shy maidens of Western romances. They are the romantic heroines of an epic era, captured in tales told for centuries down to the present day, in oral traditions throughout lands along the Silk Road. Their men are heroes and warriors whose names are still alive and who still inspire admiration for their adventures and victories. The purpose of the Dedi Korkut tales is to inspire as well as to entertain. But Dedi Korkut always appears to remind the reader of the true reality that is beyond this one. He says at the end of the tales, "They came to this world and left. Like a caravan they stopped and left. Death took them too, the earth hid them. To whom remains this world of dreams, this world of coming and going that ends at last in death?" And then he tells the reader that he has prayed 5 prayers over each of our foreheads, where Muslims believe our fate is written. When the angel of death comes, he tells us, we should say Amin and renew our faith, and surely we will go to paradise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thanks. Our second speaker is Mr. Yossi Eli. After earning his BA at Tel Aviv University in History and Computer Sciences, Yossi Eli allowed his passion for Turkish culture and society to lead him to Bosphorus University in Istanbul, where he earned his MA from the Ataturk Institute of Modern Turkish History. With an MA thesis entitled New Messages in Turkish Pop Music, 1989 to 2001, Yossi has established himself as an authority on the development of Turkish music during the 20th century, telling the fascinating story of how Turkish music, and obviously its musicians, resisted being coerced into the project of creating a uniform national culture in the modern Turkish Republic. He is currently completing his PhD thesis with the support of a Dan David Scholarship that continues to explore the production of culture, this time focusing on the Beyoğlu quarter of Istanbul during the 20th century. Yossi, please.
First of all, I must admit that this is the first time for me appearing to such a great audience, and if I faint in the middle, then may not be of a surprise. This time I would like to discuss Turkish folk music, and I would like to discuss the move from folk to pop, and its development in Turkish folk music. Throughout history, the road connecting the Far East and the Mediterranean basin, also known as the Silk Road, was the mean of transporting goods, people, as well as ideas and culture. The Silk Road was romanticized in time as a secret path to worlds of magic and wonder. Just to set an example, in Israel, for instance, this notion of fascination with the Silk Road was expressed in a sensual pop song by the same name, by the singer Judith Ravitz. However, with all its wonder and mystery, the Silk Road was mainly a mean of transportation and trade, enabling the movement of goods and people from one sphere of culture to the other. This is the reason why many people try to control it, and this is why the Silk Road, a symbol of interaction and cooperation between people, turned at times into a war prize. In this very colorful world, a world that was in constant motion, appeared the Western Turks in the late 8th century. The Turkish-speaking clans were living in the barren geography that is Central Asia before the 8th century. Their lives, as exemplified in the Turkish mythologies of Metehan and Ergenekon, mythologies that Professor Finn just mentioned, were harsh. The Western Turks were nomads in the vast steppes of Central Asia, living mostly from their trade and their herds. In fact, the Turkish tribes enabled the transport of goods from one urban center to another along the Silk Road. The spiritual world of the Western Turks claims our particular attention. The nomads of the Central Asian steppes were dependent on the whims of nature. In effect, the gods of the Turkish pantheon represented this force of nature, and thus the nomads needed someone who could connect to the gods. That person was the shaman. The shaman was the most eloquent and most charismatic member of the tribe, who would use his magic in order to transmit the petitions of his fellow tribespeople to the gods of the skies. The interesting element of this ritual of communicating with the skies was the incorporation of music. The shamans used music as an essential part of the ritual in order to express the feelings and needs of their people to the whole world, gods and humans alike. After the conversion of the Turkish tribes to Islam beginning from the 9th century, the shaman disappeared, but the tradition of the shaman, who became in Turkish the ozan, the poet, lived among the Turks. Music became a powerful tool of encapsulating and communicating social, cultural, and political messages, a tool so powerful it overcame words in its importance. As music was important, musical instruments were venerated as sacred, the mean of communication between heaven and earth. The Turks in Central Asia developed a string developed string instruments which became popular and spread to other parts of the world. Of these string instruments, the Turkish bağlama, or the long-necked lute, is of special importance. This lute became in time more than just a musical instrument. It became a part of national identity. The transportable lute was to be the instrument of the traveling ozan, the traveling poet, and many Turkish folk songs equate the sounds of the lute to heartbeats and to tears flowing from one's eyes. In Iran and India, the lute developed into the sitar. We just listened to the tar. And as it reached the West, it became the guitar, preserving the expressiveness and the charm of the lute. Just to set an example, in rock music circles, many consider, and I might add very rightly so, Jimi Hendrix to be a magician, even a shaman of guitar. He, like his predecessors, worshipped his guitar, and considered it as a path to another world. What began as a mean of communicating with the gods in the steppes of Central Asia developed into a mean of communicating with the hearts and souls of people all over the world. However, when it comes to the Turks, the shamans lost their immense religious influence as the Turks encountered the Islamic world. After the Battle of Talas in 755, the Turkish tribes of Central Asia were incorporated into the Islamic world, mostly into Muslim armies, becoming the backbone of the military profession. In the beginning, many of them retained their nomadic lifestyles and acted as mercenaries for local warlords. However, as time passed, the highly developed culture of urban Islam began to influence their own culture. Turks became a military caste in a very sophisticated society. They became sedentary. In addition to religious conversion, the Turkish language was also influenced, and many words of Turkish origins were replaced by Arab and Persian words. By the middle of the 11th century, the Seljuk clan of the Turkish Oghuz tribe began its migration from westward from Central Asia along the Silk Road. In 1071, the Seljuk army defeated and captured the Byzantine emperor. The vast territory of Anatolia was now open to Turkish and Muslim migration. The population in Anatolia, living there at the time, practiced many religions and was speaking Greek, Armenian, Laz, Syriac, and Kurdish dialects. The continuing Turkish influx into these new lands through the Silk Road reinforced the cultural presence of the Turks in Anatolia. Yet the different ethnic groups adopted cultural elements from each other. For instance, Greek peasants were converting to Islam, adopting the religion of the conquerors, while the Turks were adopting the settled lifestyles of the Anatolian peasantry. The period between the conquest of Anatolia in 1071 and the consolidation of the Ottoman political power by the mid-14th century is in fact a formative period for Turkish popular culture. These are the years of Celaleddin Rumi, the founder of the Mevlani Sufi order in Konya. By the way, actually the most important ritual of the Mevlani, of the Mevlevi Sufi order, is the Sema, the whirling dervishes, which again, it's not only about their whirling, it's also about their very unique music. Even today, in Istanbul, for instance, the quarter in which you can find the best musical instruments is located next to the tekke, the headquarters of the Mevlevi order in Istanbul. These are also the years of Köroğlu, a legendary a legendary Robin Hood-like figure of the mountains fighting for social justice in the name of the oppressed peasantry. Yunus Emre, the first poet in vernacular Turkish, was active in this time, and his poem about the love of God and nature are masterpieces of early Turkish poetry. Anatolia became to the Muslim world what Southern California was for the love generation, an area of social and cultural experiment in the most exciting times. These are also the times in which the tradition of the minstrel, or in Turkish, the aşık, which also means the person in love. The minstrel to be a minstrel also means to be in love with life. The minstrel, or the aşık, as he or she are known in Turkish, are quintessentially Turkish figures. In many respects, the successors of the Central Asian shamans. The Anatolian aşık was a wandering poet, singing to the people about every aspect of their lives. They would sing of nature, the crops, the herds, the beauty of the land, of love, and at times of politics. The aşıks were famous for being able to express the emotions of the people in Anatolia in the most precise and truthful way. This made the aşıks very powerful and very popular. In addition, due to the cultural greenhouse that was Anatolia between the 11th and 14th centuries, a group of Turkish immigrants began combining their shamanic religious traditions with Greek Orthodoxy, Zoroastrian worship, Judaism, and of course Islam. Those were the days of the birth of the Alevi, the heterodox sect of Shia Islam. Alevilik is important to our discussion because the Alevi practice of religion revolves around music, one of the few creeds to do so. Adopting elements of Zoroastrian fire ritual, the gem, the Alevi ritual, is an event in which people of both sexes sit around the fire and the aşık, with his bağlama, sings with them songs of love for nature, God, and of course, Ali. Many of the songs carry moral imperatives such as love your neighbor, be humane, treat people kindly, say the truth, and so on. As time passed, the songs of the gem developed into sophisticated forms of songwriting. On the one hand, the deyish, the speech, was the most influential type of gem songs, for as the name implies, it was a statement made by the aşık on moral, social, and even political matters. On the other hand, songs known as tersleme, or songs of the opposite, are probably the most interesting and funniest examples of gem songs, and I will elaborate on this. In these songs, the aşık tells his audience to fornicate, to tell lies, to charge interests, to steal and perform every type of sin. However, in the end of each song, he reminds everybody that he intends to promote the complete opposite behavior. Songs about mountains, rivers, and cities are very common in the corpus of Alevi folk songs. These songs, dating from Selçuk times to Republican era, form one of the richest and most colorful corpus of world folk music. Even today, Turkish folk music is very much identified with the tradition of the Alevi aşıks. However, although the Turkish musical tradition of the aşık developed during the Turkish migrations into Asia Minor, the other ethnic groups maintained their musical cultures. For instance, one of my favorites, the Laz-speaking people of the Eastern Black Sea region sang and danced to to a type of music known as choron. Now, for Israelis, we are familiar with this term choron because choron in Greek means dance, and we import it in the form of hora, the dance, the Israeli national dance. The term itself, as I just mentioned, originates from the Pontic Greek word choros, which means dance. In the southeast of today's Turkey, an area known as Al Jazeera or Mesopotamia, the Kurds would sing and dance to upbeat wedding tunes known as halay. In the west of the peninsula, Turks were influenced by the zeybek, a dance style very similar to that of the Greek sirtaki dance. Therefore, while the Turks brought with them an understanding of music as essential part of rituals and celebrations, Anatolian music was influenced by styles and traditions other than Turkish. Throughout Seljuk, Beylik, and Ottoman times, Anatolian music developed in accordance with social, economic, and cultural changes. For instance, the great rebellion of the Shiites in the early 16th century against the Ottomans, after this great rebellion, many Alevi songs were laments and songs of rebellion. Horons were mostly about nature, love, and seduction. The history of the Zeybek is very linked to the development of the figure of the Efe, a local strong man who sometimes served the big landowner or sometimes stole from him. These are just a few examples. In fact, the history of Turkish folk music, folk songs is yet again as diverse as the people who lived in Anatolia. This diversity was to point out an important characteristic of Turkish folk music, its locality. Turkish folk music is very local in its nature. For instance, this is a great example, I think. Songs of onions, the bulb, okay? Songs of onions were popular in areas where onions were grown. The Black Sea songs were about fish, cherries, and mountains, while the Alevi songs of Central and Eastern Anatolia were about social injustice. The modern term Türkü, which encompasses all Turkish folk music, is in many respects an anomaly in the sense that the musical styles of the various regions of the country are so different from one another that what makes them the same is the fact that they are not from Istanbul, the Ottoman capital. In the Ottoman capital, Istanbul, Anatolian music was regarded as music of the masses and therefore inferior to the music of the palace. This dichotomy between city and countryside played an important role in the development of Turkish folk music during late Ottoman and Republican periods. As the Ottoman state was losing power and territory, many Turkish scholars tried to define Turkish national identity. This move was the result of numerous rebellions of various minorities against the Ottoman state during the 19th century. Scholars like Mehmet Emin and Yusuf Akçura, both of Tatar origin, searched for the Turkish identity in the vast steppes, heading a cultural movement known as Turanism. On the other hand, the sociologist Ziya Gökalp stressed the importance of Anatolian culture, and in his famous work, The Principles of Turkism, Gökalp discussed the importance of local Anatolian culture, in contrast to both Ottoman urban culture and Central Asian culture. He even mentioned the importance of Turkish rural folk songs for the Turkish national identity. For Gökalp, it was the folk song that represented the Turkish spirit in the best way. He even suggested modernizing the Turkish folk song and orchestrating it in Western manner. After the Republic was established in 1923, Gökalp's ideas were adopted, and the Turkish folk song became an integral part of the Turkish endeavor of cultural engineering. The history of the Turkish folk music in Republican times is very intriguing. Unlike one might think, this very old tradition of songwriting and music adapted itself to changing circumstances. One can find many examples in folk songs of the effects of Republican reforms on the lives of Turks. There's a great example of one of the Ashiks from Erzincan, a city in central east, central Anatolia, that arrives with the waves of migrants to Istanbul, and he sees a huge. This is happening in the 1980s, and he sees a huge jeep in the streets of Istanbul, and he sings. He calls this jeep a 4x8. Something he invents new cars because he doesn't understand what is in front of him, and he calls it a 4x8 because he heard someone call it a 4x4. Moreover, as the Turkish folk song was regarded as the local musical tradition of the nation, the state supported research into folk music. Folk music choirs were established by the state, and the radio broadcast folk music extensively. Many Ashiks and non-Alevi folk music performers appeared in Republican times. People like Nida Tüfekçi, Neşet Ertaş, and of course, the blind minstrel of Sivas, Ashik Veysel. As Turkey developed more democratic regimes, the somewhat scientific and nationalistic enthusiasm for folk music was replaced by a more relaxed and popular attitude. Turkish music was promoted in the same manner as pop music. In the 1960s, Turkish rock musicians began rock interpretation of folk tunes, thus embarking on a great musical experiment known as Anadolu rock or Anatolian rock. The minstrel itself did not vanish. Arabesque, a musical style that combines various musical styles, emerged in the late 1960s, one of those styles being Anatolian folk music. The arabesque performer, like Orhan Gencebay and Ferdi Tayfur, assumed the role of the minstrel, singing to the people about the hardships of life in modern times, reflecting on social injustice and at times rebelling against it. While arabesque and Anadolu rock were modern products of the 60s and the 70s and were heavily politicized, as the country moved to the end of the 20th century, folk music became lighter and more popular in its appearance. Folk musicians began to experiment combining folk music with new styles such as rap, techno, club dance, and even punk. There is Anatolian punk. We can say today that there is something called Anatolian punk, which is great, by the way. The folk music star, the türkücü, began looking more like a model and less like a drifter. Last but not least, the jam ritual changed its form, and instead of a fire, jams began to be held in the cities in bars, thus combining music, entertainment, and mysticism all in one place. These new types of jam locales, known as türkü bars in slang, became so popular in the 1990s that many non-Alevis began attending them. The folk song took the country by storm in the age of pop. Today, folk music is a huge industry in Turkey, very popular with people in the countryside as well as in the city. The folk song is still very colorful, but this time with the availability of means of communication and any type of folk song is available at any place in the country. The Turkish folk song is as alive as it can ever be, with people from all over the world being exposed to it through television, concerts, and albums. Thus, what began in the steppes of Central Asia more than a millennium ago and migrated along the routes of the Silk Road is maintaining its original spirit in many ways. And in many ways is connecting people to the spiritual world. However, while doing so, the music imported to Anatolia via the Silk Road adapted itself to our times and is becoming as alive, as vibrant as ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yossi. We only regret that we couldn't have your talk accompanied by a series of sound demonstrations. In 1998, Yo-Yo Ma founded the Silk Road Project, and I quote, to study the ebb and flow of ideas among different cultures along the Silk Road. The Silk Road Ensemble, part of this project, quote, is not a fixed collective, but rather a collection of like-minded musicians. Each musician's career illustrates a unique response to what is arguably the paramount artistic challenge of our times, nourishing global connections while maintaining the integrity of art rooted in an authentic tradition. Yo-Yo Ma is the person who has brought all of us here this morning, for which we owe him sincere gratitude. He stresses that music is about communication. As we all know too well, communication is an art form all its own, demanding enormous skill and practice. Like any great communicator in whatever medium, Yo-Yo Ma makes his art seem to us both effortless and inspired. Please.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Why don't you guys come on? Well, first of all, thank you for this wonderful. I didn't know that we had poets as ambassadors also. Yes, it's America. You're right. And thank you. And Yossi, I wish we could be your punk rock band, and do something that is an appropriate response, because it would be really wonderful to I know probably a number of us would love to talk with you afterwards and learn much more about what's happening in Anatolia and the rest of Turkey. So I think we're going to do some playing. Before I do that, do you have my blue bag? I want to leave something with you, because we've been talking about vast swaths of history, and it's so interesting. I think Turkey is one of the great repositories of culture. And about a year ago, I came across something that National Geographic produced, and it's called the Genographic Project. So here's a tie-in to things that have traveled, or rather people that have traveled, history of human migration. With a swab of the cheek, you mail in your swab up, and through DNA analysis, the Y chromosome for the male, mitochondrial DNA for the female, there's a 5-year project that National Geographic is doing with IBM to kind of trace human migration over 70,000 years. Our human history is about 10, 12, maybe. And so I think this could be a wonderful way to have one more layer of knowledge in the various fields that we pursue because it's actually an interesting way of tracing where people have been. And there's something. So I'm leaving a kit with whoever's interested, and obviously only one person can do the swab, otherwise it messes up the experiment. So I'm leaving it here. I'll leave it with Smadar, and I'd like to play for you one thing before we play as a group. Saigun, Yossi, it's maybe the wrong piece to play, but Saigun, Adnan Saigun, is the Bartok of Turkey. He was friends with Bela Bartok. He was sort of the first composer when Ataturk came to be the first president of the Republic, and he actually invited Bartok and Hindemith to Ankara to teach there, I think in the 30s or something. And so I'm going to just start with a short piece that he wrote for cello solo. And then I think we'd like to play you some music that is partly Turkish, but in our sort of exploration of again, things that have traveled. The Gypsies, the Roma people, left Rajasthan, I think, over about 1,000 years ago. And obviously there still are Roma people in Istanbul. And this is sort of a response to that music from Romania. And so it is a piece that we called Turceska, and all of us will play. Colin Jacobson and Nick Cords, Wuman, who is playing the pipa but also doubling as the cymbalon and whatever. Mark Suda playing the what instrument? The cajon, which is an instrument from Peru with guitar strings in the back. And so the instrument is what he's sitting on, by the way. And Jeff Beecher and Johnny Gendelsman, Israel's very own violinist.
It only remains for me to thank Mr. Yo-Yo Ma and the members of the Silk Road Ensemble, my learned colleagues, and of course to you, audience, for coming to see us this morning. Thank you.
אצל השימפנזי, רווח בין השיניים נקרא דיאסטמה.